Thomas Mitchell had served the royal family for 12 years when everything changed on that crisp autumn morning. The veteran security officer stood at his usual post outside the east wing of Windsor Castle, his trained eyes scanning the grounds with the same careful attention he had maintained every single day since joining the Royal Protection Unit. At 42 years old, Thomas had dedicated his entire adult life to serving the crown. He had protected members of the royal family through countless public events, private gatherings, and international trips. His record was spotless, his loyalty unquestionable, and his commitment absolute. The other guards respected him, the senior officers trusted his judgment, and the royal family had grown comfortable with his quiet, professional presence. Prince George, now 15 years old, had grown up under Thomas's watchful eye. The young prince had transformed from a curious toddler into a thoughtful teenager, and Thomas had been there for every milestone. He remembered the prince's first steps in the palace gardens, his nervous excitement before starting school, and the way his eyes would light up when discussing his favorite books about history and science. The morning started like any other. Thomas arrived at the castle before dawn, reviewed the day's schedule with his colleagues, and took his position as the royal family began their daily routines. Prince George had a tutoring session scheduled for 9 o'clock, followed by a private meeting with his father about upcoming royal duties he would gradually begin to undertake as he approached his 16th birthday. During the tutoring session, Thomas noticed something different about the young prince. George seemed distracted, often glancing toward the windows that overlooked the castle's staff quarters. His tutor, Mrs. Catherine Wells, a patient woman in her 60s who had been teaching royal children for over 2 decades, appeared to be struggling to keep the prince focused on his literature assignment. When the session ended, Prince George approached Thomas with an unusual request. He wanted to visit the staff quarters, specifically the small apartment where Thomas lived with his wife, Sarah, and their 8-year-old daughter, Emma. This was highly irregular. Royal family members rarely visited staff accommodations, and such visits required extensive security preparations and formal arrangements. Thomas explained the protocols gently, suggesting that any visit would need to be approved by senior staff and properly arranged. But Prince George seemed unusually persistent. He explained that he had been thinking about how little he actually knew about the people who dedicated their lives to protecting and serving his family. He wanted to understand their lives better, to see how they lived and what challenges they faced. The conversation took place in the quiet corridor outside the library, where morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows on the polished marble floor. Thomas found himself in an uncomfortable position. His duty was to protect the prince, but it was also to follow protocols that existed for good reasons. Security arrangements weren't just bureaucratic formalities. They were carefully designed systems that had evolved over centuries to keep the royal family safe. Prince George seemed to understand Thomas's dilemma. The young man had inherited his grandmother's sharp intelligence and his father's compassionate nature. He suggested a compromise. What if Thomas simply told him about his family and his life, not as a guard speaking to a royal, but as one human being sharing with another? Thomas found himself hesitating. In all his years of service, he had maintained strict professional boundaries. He protected the royal family, but he didn't share personal details about his own life. It wasn't forbidden exactly, but it wasn't encouraged either. The relationship between royal protection officers and the royal family was supposed to remain professional and somewhat distant. But something in Prince George's genuine curiosity and sincere interest touched Thomas deeply. The teenager wasn't asking out of casual boredom or princely entitlement. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding the human cost of the service that surrounded him every day. So Thomas began to talk. He told Prince George about Sarah, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital and often worked double shifts to help support their family. He described Emma, who was brilliant at mathematics but struggled with reading, and how he and Sarah spent their evenings helping her with homework while worrying about whether they could afford the specialized tutoring she needed. He explained how his schedule meant missing many of Emma's school plays and soccer games, how Sarah often ate dinner alone because his shifts required him to be at the castle during evening events. He talked about the small apartment they rented near the castle, which was convenient for his work but expensive, and how they had been saving for years to buy a modest house with a garden where Emma could play. Prince George listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine concern for details that most people might overlook. When Thomas mentioned that Emma collected butterflies and loved reading about insects but couldn't afford the expensive books she wanted, the prince made a mental note that Thomas didn't notice at the time. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, far longer than Thomas had intended. When it ended, Prince George thanked him with a sincerity that surprised the experienced guard. The young prince seemed genuinely moved by what he had learned, and Thomas found himself feeling both relieved and slightly worried about having shared so much personal information. That afternoon, Prince George approached his private secretary and made an unusual request. He wanted to understand more about the compensation and working conditions of the castle staff, particularly the security personnel. He asked for reports on staff satisfaction, family situations, and any challenges the employees faced in their daily lives. His private secretary, a seasoned diplomat named Sir Robert Henley, was initially puzzled by this request. Royal family members typically didn't involve themselves in staff management issues, which were handled by professional administrators. But Prince George was insistent, explaining that he felt a responsibility to understand how his family's needs affected the people who served them. Over the following days, Prince George quietly reviewed personnel files, compensation schedules, and staff feedback reports. What he discovered troubled him deeply. Many of the castle's employees, despite their crucial roles, struggled financially. Security officers like Thomas often worked extensive hours for wages that, while respectable, barely covered the high cost of living near the castle. The prince learned that several guards had second jobs to make ends meet, that many staff members' families made significant sacrifices to support their loved ones' service to the crown, and that some of the most dedicated employees were quietly struggling with financial pressures that their professional demeanor never revealed. Prince George began to see Thomas differently. When the guard stood at his post each morning, the prince now understood that this man had likely awakened before 5 o'clock, kissed his wife goodbye before she left for her hospital shift, and left his daughter getting ready for school alone because his duty to the royal family required his presence at the castle. The weight of this realization began to affect Prince George profoundly. He had always understood intellectually that people served his family, but he had never truly grasped the personal cost of that service. The knowledge that Thomas missed his daughter's important moments, that his wife often felt like a single parent, and that their family's financial security depended entirely on his continued service to the crown, made Prince George question fundamental aspects of the system he had been born into. 1 week after their initial conversation, Prince George made a decision that would change everything. He called Thomas aside after his morning rounds and asked to speak with him privately. They walked to a quiet alcove in the castle's ancient stone corridors, where generations of royals and servants had conducted countless conversations over the centuries. Prince George began by thanking Thomas for his honesty and for helping him understand the reality of service to the royal family. Then, to Thomas's complete astonishment, the prince made an extraordinary offer. He wanted to personally ensure that Emma received the educational support she needed, that Thomas's family could afford a proper home, and that the financial pressures that kept Sarah working exhausting double shifts could be relieved. Thomas was speechless. In all his years of service, he had never imagined such a conversation. Royal family members simply didn't involve themselves personally in their staff members' private affairs. There were systems in place, charitable foundations that occasionally helped employees facing extraordinary circumstances, but direct personal intervention by a member of the royal family was virtually unheard of. Prince George explained that he had been thinking about duty, service, and responsibility since their conversation. He had come to understand that his family's comfort and security came at a significant cost to people like Thomas and his family. The prince felt that acknowledging this cost and taking personal responsibility for it was part of his own duty as a future king. The offer was generous beyond anything Thomas had ever imagined. Prince George wanted to establish a trust fund that would pay for Emma's education through university, provide a down payment for the family to purchase their own home, and ensure that Sarah could reduce her working hours to spend more time with their daughter. Thomas felt overwhelmed by the prince's kindness, but he also felt deeply uncomfortable. Accepting such generosity would fundamentally change his relationship with the royal family. He would no longer be simply a professional protector. He would become someone who owed a personal debt of gratitude that could never be repaid. More importantly, Thomas realized that accepting Prince George's offer would compromise his ability to do his job effectively. How could he maintain the necessary professional distance? How could he make difficult security decisions if they might disappoint or endanger someone who had shown such personal kindness to his family? The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Prince George earnestly trying to convince Thomas that accepting help was appropriate and Thomas struggling to explain why such kindness actually made his position impossible. As the afternoon sun began to set through the castle windows, Thomas came to a painful conclusion that would change his life forever. Thomas spent that entire night awake, staring at the ceiling of his small bedroom while Sarah slept peacefully beside him. The weight of Prince George's unexpected offer pressed down on him like a physical burden. In the darkness, he replayed the conversation over and over, trying to find some way to reconcile his professional responsibilities with the prince's genuine desire to help his family. Sarah noticed his restlessness and asked what was troubling him, but Thomas found himself unable to explain the situation. How could he tell his wife that a 15-year-old prince had offered to solve all their financial problems? How could he explain that such kindness might force him to abandon the career that had defined his entire adult life? When morning came, Thomas arrived at the castle earlier than usual, hoping to clear his thoughts before beginning his duties. But the familiar routines that had always grounded him now felt different. Every time he saw Prince George, he was reminded of the conversation that had changed everything. The professional distance he had maintained for 12 years had been shattered by a teenager's compassionate desire to help. Prince George, meanwhile, seemed puzzled by Thomas's obvious distress. The young prince had expected gratitude and relief, not the troubled expression that Thomas now wore constantly. During their brief interactions throughout the day, Prince George repeatedly asked if Thomas was feeling well, if there was anything he needed, if he had reconsidered the offer. Each inquiry only deepened Thomas's dilemma. The prince's continued concern demonstrated exactly why accepting the help would be impossible. Prince George was beginning to see Thomas as someone he cared about personally, rather than as a professional protector whose job was to remain invisible and objective. 3 days passed in this uncomfortable state. Thomas found himself making mistakes he had never made before, arriving late to briefings, missing small security details, struggling to concentrate during important meetings. His colleagues began to notice his unusual behavior, but Thomas couldn't explain what was troubling him without betraying the confidence Prince George had placed in him. On Thursday morning, Thomas made a decision. He requested a private meeting with Sir Robert Henley, Prince George's private secretary, to discuss a matter of protocol. Sir Robert agreed to see him during his lunch break, and they met in the secretary's oak-paneled office overlooking the castle gardens. Thomas explained the situation carefully, emphasizing Prince George's good intentions while outlining his own professional concerns. Sir Robert listened with growing alarm, recognizing immediately the complex problems that Prince George's generosity had created. The experienced diplomat understood that the young prince's desire to help, while admirable, threatened to undermine the very foundations of professional royal service. Sir Robert explained to Thomas that similar situations had arisen occasionally throughout royal history, usually with problematic outcomes. When members of the royal family became personally involved in their staff members' private lives, it inevitably led to complications that compromised everyone involved. Professional boundaries existed not just to maintain formality, but to protect both the royal family and their employees from exactly these kinds of dilemmas. The conversation lasted over an hour, with Sir Robert carefully exploring every possible solution. Could Thomas accept the help but transfer to a different position? Could the assistance be provided through official channels rather than as a personal gift? Could some compromise be reached that would satisfy Prince George's desire to help while maintaining professional boundaries? Each possibility was examined and ultimately rejected. Thomas's expertise was specifically in royal protection, and transferring him to a different role would waste years of specialized training and experience. Providing assistance through official channels would require justifications that didn't exist, potentially creating precedents that could cause problems throughout the royal household. And any compromise that allowed Prince George to personally help Thomas's family would still fundamentally alter their professional relationship. Finally, Sir Robert asked Thomas directly what he wanted to do. The question hung in the air between them, and Thomas found himself voicing thoughts he had barely acknowledged to himself. He loved his job, took enormous pride in serving the royal family, and considered his role as a royal protection officer to be more than just employment. It was a calling that gave meaning to his life. But Prince George's kindness had made it impossible for Thomas to continue in that role, not because the prince had done anything wrong, but because the very goodness of his intentions had created an impossible situation. Thomas could no longer serve as an objective professional protector when he would always be conscious of personal debt and gratitude. With a heavy heart, Thomas told Sir Robert that he believed his only option was to resign from the Royal Protection Unit. The words felt like a physical blow as he spoke them, but he knew they were true. Prince George's compassionate offer had inadvertently made Thomas's continued service impossible. Sir Robert was quiet for a long moment, understanding the tragedy of the situation. A dedicated, experienced protection officer was about to lose his career not because of any failure or misconduct, but because a young prince had tried to do something kind. The diplomat asked Thomas to take a few more days to consider his decision, but Thomas knew his mind was made up. That afternoon, Prince George approached Thomas again, this time with even more detailed plans for helping his family. The prince had consulted with financial advisors and had worked out exactly how the trust fund would operate, how the house purchase could be arranged, and how Sarah's work schedule could be adjusted. His excitement and genuine enthusiasm for solving Thomas's family's problems only made the situation more heartbreaking. Thomas listened patiently to Prince George's elaborate plans, watching the teenager's face light up as he described how Emma would be able to attend any school she wanted, how the family could finally have the garden they had dreamed of, how Sarah could pursue additional nursing training that had been financially impossible before. When Prince George finished explaining his plans, he looked at Thomas expectantly, clearly hoping for enthusiasm and gratitude. Instead, Thomas asked if they could sit down for another serious conversation. They found chairs in a quiet corner of the library, surrounded by centuries-old books that had witnessed countless conversations between royals and their servants over the generations. Thomas began by telling Prince George how deeply moved he was by the offer, and how much it meant to know that his family's struggles had touched the prince's heart. He explained that in all his years of service, he had never encountered such personal kindness from any member of the royal family, and that Prince George's compassion revealed the kind of king he would one day become. But then Thomas began to explain why he couldn't accept the help. He talked about professional boundaries, about the importance of maintaining objectivity in security work, about how personal relationships could compromise his ability to make difficult decisions if dangerous situations arose. He tried to help Prince George understand that accepting such generosity would fundamentally change their relationship in ways that would ultimately harm both of them. Prince George listened with growing confusion and distress. The teenager had never considered that his desire to help could create problems. In his mind, he was simply trying to take care of people who had taken care of his family. The idea that kindness could be problematic was completely foreign to his understanding of the world. The conversation became increasingly emotional as Prince George struggled to understand why Thomas was rejecting help that would solve his family's problems. The prince even offered to modify the arrangement to make it less personal or more official, anything that would allow Thomas to accept the assistance his family clearly needed. Thomas found himself in the impossible position of having to explain to a 15-year-old prince why goodness could sometimes create problems. He talked about duty, about professional ethics, about the complicated relationship between service and gratitude. But Prince George remained unconvinced, believing that Thomas was being unnecessarily stubborn about accepting help that was freely and lovingly offered. Finally, Thomas made the most difficult decision of his professional life. He told Prince George that he would be resigning from the Royal Protection Unit. The words hit the young prince like a physical blow. In his attempt to help someone he cared about, Prince George had inadvertently driven away one of the most dedicated protectors his family had ever had. Prince George immediately protested, saying he would withdraw his offer, that they could pretend the conversation had never happened, that everything could go back to the way it was before. But Thomas gently explained that it was too late for that. Their relationship had already changed. Prince George now saw Thomas as a person with a family and problems and dreams, rather than as a professional protector who existed only to serve. And Thomas now saw Prince George as someone whose kindness had touched his heart, rather than as someone whose safety was simply his job to ensure. The tragedy of the situation became clear to both of them. Prince George's compassion, which should have been purely positive, had accidentally destroyed the professional relationship that had allowed them to interact for 12 years. The very qualities that would make Prince George a good king, his empathy, his desire to help people, his recognition of others' humanity, had made it impossible for Thomas to continue serving him professionally. Prince George begged Thomas to reconsider, promising that he would never again try to help any staff member, that he would maintain strict professional boundaries with everyone who worked for his family. But Thomas knew that such promises would only damage the prince's natural compassion and empathy, qualities that were essential to his future role as king. As their conversation ended, both Prince George and Thomas understood that they were facing a loss that neither of them wanted and that couldn't be prevented. The prince would lose a protector who had become like family to him, and Thomas would lose a career that had given meaning and purpose to his life. All because of an act of kindness that had been pure in its intentions, but impossible in its consequences. The weeks following Thomas's decision were among the most difficult in Prince George's young life. The teenager had never before experienced the complex emotions that came with good intentions leading to heartbreaking consequences. He found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about kindness, duty, and the relationships between people of different social positions. Thomas submitted his formal resignation to the head of royal security, citing personal reasons for his departure. His supervisor, Colonel James Harrison, was shocked by the loss of one of his most experienced and reliable officers. When pressed for details, Thomas could only say that circumstances had made it impossible for him to continue his duties effectively. Word of Thomas's resignation spread quickly through the royal household. His colleagues were bewildered by his decision to leave what many considered one of the most prestigious security positions in the country. Thomas had no disciplinary issues, no health problems, and no obvious reasons for abandoning a career he had always seemed to love. The mystery of his departure became a source of constant speculation among the castle staff. Prince George struggled with feelings he had never experienced before. The teenager felt responsible for destroying the career of someone he had come to care about deeply. He also felt guilty about his previous ignorance regarding the personal sacrifices his family's staff made to serve them. Most painfully, he began to question whether his natural instincts toward kindness and helping others were actually character flaws that would make him a poor king. Sarah noticed the dramatic change in her husband's behavior immediately. Thomas had always been serious about his work, but now he seemed genuinely depressed. He slept poorly, ate little, and spent hours staring out their apartment window toward the castle, where he had worked for 12 years. When Sarah asked what was wrong, Thomas could only say that his job situation had become complicated. Emma, their 8-year-old daughter, sensed the tension in their household, but couldn't understand its source. She noticed that her father seemed sad, and that her parents often stopped talking when she entered the room. The child began to worry that she had done something wrong to upset her family. Prince George's academic performance began to suffer as he struggled to concentrate on his studies. His tutors noticed that the usually attentive student seemed distracted and melancholy. When Mrs. Wells asked if he was feeling unwell, Prince George could only shake his head and try to refocus on his lessons. 3 weeks after their final conversation, Prince George made another decision that surprised everyone around him. He requested a meeting with his father, Prince William, to discuss what he described as an urgent matter of royal protocol and personal responsibility. The meeting took place in Prince William's private study, a comfortable room filled with family photographs and books about history and conservation. Prince George had always felt comfortable talking with his father, but this conversation would be different from any they had shared before. Prince George began by telling his father about his growing awareness of the personal sacrifices made by the royal staff. He explained how his conversations with Thomas had opened his eyes to the real cost of royal service, not just for the staff members themselves, but for their families. He described his discovery that many castle employees struggled financially despite their dedication and professionalism. Prince William listened carefully, recognizing that his son was grappling with profound questions about privilege, responsibility, and the nature of service. The future king had himself wrestled with similar issues when he was younger, trying to understand his place in a system that granted him enormous privilege while expecting others to sacrifice for his comfort and security. Then Prince George told his father about his offer to help Thomas's family and about Thomas's resignation in response. As he spoke, the teenager began to cry, overcome by the realization that his attempt to do good had caused harm to someone he cared about. He explained how guilty he felt about his ignorance of his staff's struggles and how confused he was about the relationship between kindness and duty. Prince William was deeply moved by his son's distress and by the moral complexity of the situation Prince George had encountered. The experienced royal understood immediately why Thomas had felt compelled to resign and why Prince George felt responsible for the outcome. He also recognized that this experience, while painful, was teaching his son essential lessons about leadership, privilege, and the unintended consequences of good intentions. Father and son talked for over 2 hours about the challenges of royal life, the responsibilities that came with their position, and the delicate balance between compassion and professional boundaries. Prince William shared his own struggles with similar issues and explained how he had learned to channel his desire to help people through formal charitable work rather than personal intervention in individual lives. Prince William also helped Prince George understand that Thomas's decision to resign was actually evidence of the man's integrity and professionalism, not a failure on Prince George's part. The protection officer had recognized that accepting personal help would compromise his ability to do his job effectively, and he had chosen professional ethics over personal benefit. By the end of their conversation, Prince George had gained a deeper understanding of the complexities of royal life, but he still felt heartbroken about losing someone who had become important to him. Prince William suggested that they might find appropriate ways to ensure that Thomas's sacrifice didn't leave his family in the difficult financial situation that had prompted Prince George's original concern. Working together, father and son developed a plan that would honor Thomas's professional ethics while still addressing the underlying problems that had troubled Prince George. Rather than offering personal assistance to individual staff members, they would work to improve compensation and benefits for all royal household employees. This would help families like Thomas's without creating the personal obligations that had made Thomas's position impossible. Prince William used his influence to initiate a comprehensive review of royal household employment practices. The review examined compensation levels, working conditions, family support services, and career development opportunities. While the process would take months to complete, it represented a systemic approach to the problems that Prince George's conversation with Thomas had revealed. Meanwhile, Thomas struggled with his decision to leave royal service. Despite his certainty that resignation was necessary, he found it difficult to imagine what he would do next. His entire career had been in security work, specifically royal protection. His skills and experience were highly specialized, and he worried about finding employment that would provide adequate support for his family. Thomas began applying for security positions with private companies and government agencies, but none of the available jobs offered the same sense of purpose he had found in royal service. He had been motivated not just by the prestige of protecting the royal family, but by genuine belief in the importance of the monarchy and personal affection for the family he had served. Prince George asked Sir Robert Henley to arrange one final meeting with Thomas before the Guard's official departure date. The prince wanted to apologize for the unintended consequences of his offer and to express his gratitude for Thomas's years of dedicated service. The meeting took place in the same library corner where they had shared their last serious conversation. Both Prince George and Thomas were emotional, knowing that this would likely be their final private interaction. The professional relationship that had lasted 12 years was ending, and both of them felt the weight of that loss. Prince George began by apologizing sincerely for creating the situation that had forced Thomas to resign. He explained that he had never intended to make Thomas's job impossible, and that he now understood the importance of professional boundaries that he had previously taken for granted. The prince also expressed his deep gratitude for Thomas's years of service and his admiration for the man's integrity in choosing professional ethics over personal benefit. Thomas responded by thanking Prince George for opening his eyes to the prince's genuine care for the people who served his family. He explained that while the situation had ended his career in royal service, he didn't regret their conversations because they had shown him the kind of king Prince George would one day become. Thomas expressed his belief that the prince's compassion and empathy would serve the country well, even if those same qualities had made their continued professional relationship impossible. Both of them acknowledged the tragedy of the situation, that Prince George's best qualities as a future king had ended Thomas's career as his protector, and that Thomas's integrity in maintaining professional standards had deprived the royal family of one of their most dedicated servants. As they said goodbye, Prince George made one final request. He asked Thomas to remember that being forced to resign because of a prince's kindness was actually a testament to his own character and professionalism. Thomas had chosen duty over personal benefit, and that choice honored both his own values and the service he had given to the crown. Thomas left royal service on a Friday afternoon in November, exactly 12 years and 3 months after he had begun. His colleagues organized a small farewell gathering, though few of them understood why he was leaving. Thomas accepted their good wishes gracefully, but couldn't bring himself to explain the real reasons for his departure. Prince George watched from his study window as Thomas walked across the castle courtyard for the last time as a royal protection officer. The teenager understood that he had learned valuable lessons about leadership, privilege, and the complexity of human relationships, but the knowledge had come at a cost that would always sadden him. 6 months later, Thomas found new employment as head of security for a large charitable foundation. The work was meaningful and well compensated, though it lacked the sense of historical significance he had found in royal service. Sarah was able to reduce her hospital hours, and Emma began receiving the educational support she needed. Prince George, meanwhile, threw himself into charitable work with a new understanding of how privilege could be used responsibly to help others without creating personal obligations that compromised professional relationships. The lessons he learned from his experience with Thomas shaped his approach to royal duty for the rest of his life. Years later, when Prince George became king, he often thought about Thomas Mitchell and the protection officer whose integrity had taught a young prince that sometimes the greatest kindness requires accepting that good intentions alone are not enough to navigate the complex relationships between service, duty, and compassion. The experience had taught him that being a good king meant understanding not just what help people needed, but how to provide that help in ways that honored everyone's dignity and professionalism.